right, we have a special guest today, and this is Dr. Ruth Auer. Dr. Auer was principal for us back in the 70s and 80s. She was in Allendale Elementary. She then became assistant superintendent for elementary curriculum and education in our schools, and retired, I think, about 1988 or so, 87, right in there. But she wrote her dissertation for her doctorate on the history of West Seneca schools. So we're very glad that she's here and going to share the schools from way back to centralization. All right, so that's her period of interest and information. Take it away, Ruth.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. Dissertations are usually a hypothesis, a small problem within a larger genre. And people take that small problem and they do a lot of testing and a lot of statistics. So usually a dissertation is loaded with statistics, and nobody ever picks it up again and ever reads it or ever does anything with it, except somebody else in the same field might want to pick that as a reference. That's about it. So I was not that kind of a person. I am not a statistics-oriented person. So I decided when I had to do my doctorate that I wanted to do something that had some meaning for me and for people who might read it someday. So Dr. Markello was my guidance person, and we talked about it, and I said, I'd like to do a history of the schools before centralization, because I don't know anything about them. And most of the people I've talked to don't know anything about them either. So he said, well, that's a lot of research. You've got to do all the research that you can find in books, and there aren't very many. And you have to interview whoever is still alive at this time, and other people who might know something about somebody who was alive not too long ago. So I decided, really, as an art teacher, former art teacher years ago, I would really like to do the history of the schools. So that's what I did. The first school, the start of formal education in West Seneca, 1807 to 1892 was the start of formal education. You know, West Seneca was a first-ring suburb of Buffalo. The boundaries were the northwest sides of Buffalo. The three towns, Cheektowaga, Elm, and Orchard Park, were the other boundaries. The three creeks and you know, I said creeks because it's West Seneca and Buffalo, not creeks. But the three creeks were Buffalo Creek, Casanova Creek, and Smokes Creek. And that's important to where the placement of some of these buildings were. Originally, this whole section of West Seneca was occupied by the Indians of the Neuter and the Wenro nations. Then, after the American Revolution, along came the Senecas, the Onondagas, and the Mohawks. The August 1790 census, which was the first census taken of people here, there were 2 people per square mile in West Seneca. Now look at it. In 1811, there was the first mission school. It was a 2-story log building with a large classroom upper, and the missionaries lived in the lower. And it was on Buffum Street in South Buffalo and the border of West Seneca. Now, do you all know where Buffum Street is? Okay, and you know that there was Indian Park right across. That was part of the missions. You lived on Buffum? I started teaching at 70 right across the street from Indian Park.
I remember you.
You do? Okay. By 1838, the white settlers were arriving. The Indians left to go to Cattaraugus County. They were German Lutherans, Ebenezers, and there were 237 of them total. They took possession of the 7,622 acres in West Seneca and Alma. There were 4 hamlets in West Seneca at the time: Lower Ebenezer, Middle Ebenezer, New Ebenezer, and Upper Ebenezer. Do you all know where those places are? I'll try to point them out if you don't. Lower Ebenezer was the real Ebenezer area. right here. Middle Ebenezer was Gardenville. New Ebenezer was Clinton, east of Union. And Upper Ebenezer was over here in Blossom, toward Elma. Okay. The first school class was held in an abandoned Indian sawmill, because after the Indians left, they left their sawmills. And the boards in the sawmill, on the floorboards, were several inches apart. They didn't come together as boards would, because it was a sawmill and there was nothing to hold it back, and the rain and the snow and everything would just fall through. But anyway, this wide flank floor left a lot of openings, and it's been noted that the children fished through them into the creeks below, because all these sawmills were over a creek. A German was spoken only. The days were long and hard, the same as the parents. They were out working long hours. The kids went to school, the long hours also. 6 days a week, no holidays, and no summers off. The only time they didn't have school was harvest time, because the kids worked in the orchards and the vineyards, and there were no parties, nor socials, a full simplistic life. Men wore well-trimmed beards, no mustaches. Do you know why?
Something to do with winter?
Evil. The beards were okay, but the mustaches, they were evil. Okay. The women wore black, blue, or gray, full calico dresses and bonnets. Now, the town of Seneca, which was formed October 16, 1851, the north part became Lackawanna, the south part became Hamburg. It changed to West Seneca shortly thereafter, because there was another town down the road a piece that was also named Seneca, and it was very confusing. So since they were west of that town, it was called West Seneca. That's how you got your name. In 1861, when it started the Civil War, the Ebenezers did not want to join. They didn't want any part of war because they were a very strict society. So they gave $300 and some food and clothing to the war effort. That was it. The service was against their religion. Then all of a sudden, because around 1865, the population in West Seneca began to increase. And the Ebenezers found that their religion was not coterminous with the new religions that the new people were bringing in. So they then left for Iowa, and there's the Amana Society. This is background. The old schoolhouse, the sawmill, was replaced with a new building, a school, at 19 School Street in Gardenville. You all know where that is? Okay. It was sold to the Lutherans as an orphanage, and it had school wing and farm. It closed in 1960. This was Springs Road, Sulphur Springs Road. This road that came in here was called Sulphur Springs because this was Sulphur Springs right here. It seems that that creek and that land around there, all the water that they got from there was sulfur water. And so it was called Sulphur Springs Road. Well, eventually, the sulfur disappeared and they got great mineral water out of there. So it became Mineral Springs Road. And people used to come and have baths there in the mineral water. And then they built that school, which became an orphanage. And it was a 2-floor school. And then they put a little building on next to it that had the classes in it. I taught there once. When I was teaching at School 70, one day a week we would go to the Lutheran home, because it was under the city of Buffalo at that time. And we would go there and we would teach. There were 3 classes. We would rotate, 3 of us would go, and one would teach this group, then another one would come in and teach that one, and then the third one would come in and teach that one, and then we'd go back to School 70. One day a week we were over there. In 1895, West Seneca was starting to grow really fast. In 1899, the Lackawanna Steel Plant was bringing in all kinds of people. And some of them didn't want to settle in Lackawanna, so they settled in West Seneca instead. But that was the start of the big enrollment push into West Seneca. This first, I told you, was the mission school. There was no public education. West Seneca had 8 separate school districts. They were, 6 are in the present central school district, but they had 8 at the beginning. Ebenezer was the first district. It was district number 1, and it was first recorded May 7th, 1912. The principal was a Mr. W.J. Breen. The superintendent was H.G. Dan. The tax rate, I'm sure you'll appreciate, was $6 per thousand of assessed valuation. $6. What would that buy you today? There were 4 teachers. One did grades 1 and 2. She got $11 a week. One did grade 3 and 4. She got $12 a week. One did grade 5 and 6. Got $13 a week. Those were their wages in 1913. It's a corner of Ridge and Mill. Originally, that was called Ridge Road. Seneca Street, not Seneca.
Main Street.
Main Street. It was called Ridge Road. And it was right up there. 1914, they had the first library at Ebenezer. It was a real leader among the schools in West Seneca. Yes?
Did they learn German in school?
I can't hear you.
Did they learn German and they were always speaking German?
Yes, and we're still speaking German. Excuse me. In World War 1915 to 16, when World War I started, they were lacking space, so they didn't take any children under age 6. They were very stringent about their money. The principal got $1,000 a year, and that was it. 1920s, between 9 and 3, the time for teachers was between 8:40 and 4 o'clock. The time for students was 9 to 3. They did have fire drills. All children were to march in and march out. And when I taught at School 70, they were still marching in and marching out. They needed a new building. So Bellwood was built. Mr. Stanley Butcher was appointed the principal. And believe it or not, he was arrested. He was arrested for corporal punishment. He evidently whacked a kid on the bottom. Didn't say, but they said he was arrested. And in 1924, if a child failed more than one subject, they weren't promoted. The first year of high school was added as it became a union-free school. And what do you know? They brought back Mr. Butcher. Mm-hmm. 1928, the first high school graduating class. And Beischotten, you remember Beischotten? He was named the assistant principal there. So that was school number 1, Ebenezer. It was a leader among all the schools in West Seneca. Now, each of the schools was an entity unto himself. There was no group that brought them together. They were each their own private school. Most of them became union-free school districts, and they were a community school, and they didn't talk to each other at all. If you lived in Ebenezer, you went to Ebenezer. If you lived someplace else, you went there. There was no chance of moving to any other place. Okay. That was district number 1, the leader of the schools. District number 2 started in May 23rd, 1864, and it was the beginning of a public school system. They purchased a building and a lot for school, not to exceed $800. Meantime, they rented a room for classes in an abandoned sawmill. The rent was $13.50. And it included benches, desks, a pail, and a broom. Now, the pail was not for cleaning. It was drinking water, which they got from the lady next door. They would have to go and fill the pail and bring it over. There was one woman teacher, not fully identified, and they were there until 1869. 1875, Mr. George Ferrand was hired for $12 a week for the winter months. Miss Virginia Kaler, who was a relative of the Virginia Kaler we all knew later on, she got $6 a week for 14 weeks in the summer. So they had different teachers for winter and summer. In 1896, they built a new schoolhouse, and it was to be built for $5,000. It was erected on Union Road, just northeast of Buffalo Creek. This building became the property of the Union Fire Company later. Do you all know where the Union Fire Company was?
Yeah.
That's where the first school was for District Number 2. The first academic high school began there. It was directed by a Miss Carrie Hiley, B-E-I-L-L-Y, I think that's the way you pronounce it. In 1904, they had their first graduating class. Bill Deitch was a member of that class. Do you all remember Bill Deitch was a school attorney? This was his predecessor, his either grandfather or father. He was a member of that class. And then his descendant became the school attorney for West Seneca Central. The only high school for many years in West Seneca was held there. In 1924, they had a new brick building erected on the opposite side of Union Road for grades K to 12. In 1927, they were the first school to have a telephone. None of the others had telephones. That was the first one, District Number 2. And the first principal was George Coupian. He got $2,600, but he got let go for very undocumented reasons. Who knows? Same thing happens today. Later, Mr. Henry Shefflin got $2,400, a little less, to take his place. The German language was still taught there, one period a week. Then a Mr. Theodore Hopkins and Les Vance were the teachers there until centralization. 1945, Gardenville High School basketball team won the Class B championship over all of Erie, Niagara, Cattaraugus, and Orleans County. So that I thought was something very important to say. Okay, that was District Number 2. District 3 was Lower Ebenezer, Willink. It was near the Buffalo City line. It was up in here. Willink. That's the Buffalo City line there. Okay. In 1866, they had a small school at the corner of Orchard Park Road and Potter Road, the present site of the Bosse's School. And that was where they started. In June 1st, 1894 to around 1896, the school site changed, and it went to Seneca Street at Edgewood, which was where it was now Bellwood. There was a small wooden structure first. In 1900 to 1912, the enrollment increased, and 2 additions were built on the small wooden structure. In 1912, they finally had to move the old wooden building around the corner to Flore Avenue. At the time I wrote this dissertation, it was being used as an apartment house. I don't know whether it still is or not. Anybody live on Flore?
Still
is.
Is it still being used as an apartment house? Great. Okay. In 1908, Mr. Henry Frank was named the principal. We all remember Mr. Frank. 5 teachers. They were all old maids and 1 janitor. They had to be old maids. You couldn't be married or have children and be a teacher at that time. 1912, they voted to be a union-free school district, so it had nothing to do with anybody else. 1917, World War I, they had their first graduating class from grade 8. Then they kept adding until it became a high school. In 1920, they added 4 more classrooms. In 1927, they built an annex at Harlem and Slade, where the old school had been. And there they kept the kindergarten and grade 2 and had a gymnasium. The teachers were expected to live in West Seneca and they were asked their religion. West Seneca was totally Protestant at that time. District 3 continued. They offered classes in physical education. They were one of the first to have kindergartens. The parents had to pick them up to only go to grade 8 and then work on truck farms in the area. They didn't go to high school, they worked. The teachers were expected to coach and do all the other extras with no additional salary. They were expected to belong to the New York State retirement system by 1921. 1930, the board reported that the morals of the pupils are excellent. Plus. Sometime in the 1930s, they added remedial reading. But way back there. And we talk about remedial reading still today. Edgewood, then, as a street, became Bellwood Street because of the building there. The teachers were expected to do first aid, treat illnesses, do everything, no additional money. 34, wait a minute. Tom Daly was hired, and at times he taught both Latin, math, business, and history. You all remember Tom Daly?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he's a great guy. And he was at, and sometimes he taught at the 2 high schools as well. Later he taught at West Senior High. 1945, Mr. Frank retired. Mr. Alfred Goodrich became the principal of number 3. He had been a teacher there. I've seen all along from the beginning that the people who were promoted to the administrative jobs were all former teachers. They didn't go outside for anybody. That was District 3. See, I'm going just up to centralization, not beyond that. District 4 was the southern portion of West Seneca and was in the town of Hamburg. The 1847 school number 19 on 1 acre of land diagonally across from Allendale was a 2-room school, a small wooden structure. And it was still there when I came in 1967, and it's now gone. It had a large stove, no indoor plumbing. Drinking water, as I said again, was carried from the neighbor's pump in a tin pail. And it used to freeze in the winter. So you didn't get any, no drinks in the winter. In 1898, there was a booklet copyright. It was all handwritten, and it was entered in the Erie County Fair in 1904. And it won first premium. 1936, they organized a PTA because of the need for a new school. The 3 sites were proposed. Allendale Road was chosen. In the meantime, grades 5, 6, 7, and 8 were taught in the Reserve Fire Hall. You all know where Reserve is. 1939, they put up a red brick and stone building trimmed in white. It opened as Allendale District Number 4. It was not popular with the farmers. One farmer actually shot at the kids at dismissal time. The PTA developed into the most active PTA in West Seneca. In 1944-45, Mrs. Klink left as a principal. And Bess Martin, who was appointed a teaching principal. So she had to teach and be principal there. The old building was sold to Mr. Lewis for tractor and mower sales, and I think he's still there. And Mrs. Martin, at the time I wrote this, was retired and living in Florida, and so was Connie Hendler. But I knew her as a primary supervisor from kindergarten to 3 when I started there, and Connie Hendler was the supervisor for grades 4, 5, and 6. Okay, District 5. District 5 wasn't really in West Seneca. It was the early town boundaries of West Seneca, and it reached to Lake Erie. Part of it, on this side, became Lackawanna in 1909, and just south, this small area was in Hamburg and East Hamburg, and part of it, below here, is Orchard Park. There was 1902, they built another wooden building on the main road. It had one large room, one teacher, and 20 kids. Mr. Johann Hart taught all the grades 1 to 8. The older kids assisted the teacher. They were the assistants. The farmers were German and Irish descent. The school it was on 360 in my book if you want to look it up. Fisher and Langner were board members. You know those streets now? Fisher and Langner. As the steel plant expanded, many Italian families moved into the area. 1942, the population increased, so a nice brick structure was built. It was then a common school district. The original building became the American Legion Glad Post. It's near the overpass now on Abbott Road. Do you know where that is?
Yeah.
That was the original building there. Then the neighboring parochial school closed, Our Lady of the Sacred Heart. So the enrollment increased at School District 5. So 2 additions were built, one in 1946 and one in 1949. The students stayed at 5 until they passed Regents, then went to Lackawanna High School. They didn't have to graduate from 8th grade to go to Lackawanna High. They just had to pass the Regents. And if they were 6th or 7th or 8th, they took them in Lackawanna High. Then 55% of the students in District 5 lived in Lackawanna, but the rest were from Hamburg, West Seneca, and Orchard Park. In 1944, there was a committee called the RAP Committee, and it considered centralization. Well, they didn't know what to do about it, so they had some meetings. 5 people voted to go to Hamburg Big Tree, 5 voted for Blaisdell number 8, 5 voted for Orchard Park, but Orchard Park centralized without them by 1949. So they only had left Hamburg Big Tree and Blaisdell. So by 1949, Hamburg number 7 and 8 were into one district using 3 elementary buildings, K6, and a second 712. Lackawanna and new high school was built on Martin Road. So they didn't know what to do with the kids if they centralized. 1946, they had this RAP commission again, and they didn't know what to do. As I said, District 5 didn't know what to do. So 1952, the principal, Miss Margaret Chalou, you all remember Margaret, K8, she became director of elementary ed at the time I wrote the dissertation. She gave voters a choice. There were 37 voters. 3 of them wanted to go to Lackawanna High, 4 wanted to go to Orchard Park, and 30 wanted to go to West Seneca, even though 55% lived in Lackawanna. They wanted to build their own high school right there, but the education commissioner said no. So they couldn't do that. So in 1958, Lackawanna said no. 1959, they needed space. So the population kept growing and growing in all these school districts. So they leased a building on Fisher Road for K3 as an annex to number 5. Remember Bill Green as principal? He started there. And he went on to be principal, as I said, at Clinton. It dissolved as Union Free District number 5 on April 1st, 1962, and accepted decentralization. But it was the last holdout. The others were all centralized by that time. And District 5, as I said, had to make a decision, and they decided to come with West Seneca. District 6, this is where it gets tricky with the maps of the old times. District 6, 1880 maps showed school districts, but no facts. And on it, there would be a 6, and a 7, and an 8, and then the next map would have 6, 7, and 8. They're real crazy, so this may not be totally accurate. 1851 to 1855, on the north side of Ridge Road, on the site of the Lackawanna Library, now facing South Park Avenue, they built a little school. Population increased. 1876, they built a new school of red brick, 1 room with 3 teachers. All, the women, one in fall, one taught in fall, one only in spring, and in winter, a man taught. Crazy. 1896, they had a building with 2 stories and a basement. There were 2 rooms on each floor. It later became school number 1 of Lackawanna, which later became Washington Elementary. And so on March 3rd, 1905, it became number 6 of West Seneca, union free. Mr. Albert Cook was the superintendent, and the high school was taught by a Miss Murphy. In 1969, the small frame building on Michael Road became early district number 6, but it was really part of Orchard Park Central School, but really became number 6 of West Seneca. The 6, 7, and 8 are very confusing. So that was 6. District 7. It was the far eastern section of West Seneca, a rural farm area. 1969, there was no factual information available then. The picture in Mr. Lank's Just for Old Time's Sake booklet showed a small frame building, 1 room, housing 8 grades. The building was later sold and moved to Bullis Road. 1916 to 1917, a new brick building opened on the original site on Seneca Street, east of the Center Road intersection. It's now, I think, houses a graphic arts company or something. If you know Lorraine Kerner, it was kind of like right across the street from where she lived. It's when you turn around by Perry's, and you keep going out, Seneca's on the left-hand side. 1933, an addition was put on. Well, first of all, the new brick building. And they had 2 classrooms and 2 in the basement. And the 2 in the basement were used for physical education and a cafeteria. There were 2 teachers and an outhouse. There was no plumbing. In 1933, they added on boys and girls lavatories. 1 large classroom, 1 multi-purpose room, a stage, and it was used to be an auditorium or gym. All 8 grades. 1 and 2 was taught with 1 teacher, 3 and 4, 1 teacher in the new building. Grades 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 stayed in the original building with a teaching principal, Mr. Robert Hickey. I don't remember him at all, but maybe some
Great guy.
Was he? And he was later replaced by Miss Hendler, Cornelia Hendler, who became our 4 to 6 supervisor later on. The other teachers were Miss Laura Scholl and Miss Charlotte Knack, who were still teaching when I was there in 1967. They were still teaching in West Seneca at the time of centralization. After grade 8, the kids went to Ebenezer High School, if space allowed, because Ebenezer High School was getting filled up also. Or they went to the old Central High School in Buffalo, or they went to a trade school. That's what happened to the kids at District 7. Then Mr. Harold Dobsteff, I think you all remember him. He was a trustee of number 7, and he led the community to centralization. They were all grades in the last class before centralization. They went on to higher ed in fields like engineering, dentistry, ministry, and so forth. So he was very proud of his school. And Mr. Dobsteff was elected to the Centralization Board, and he served 5 years unopposed, which is good for him. Now, District 8, again, as I said, it was 6, 7, and 8 were up and down. It was the very newest section of the original town of West Seneca, and it was not part of Ebenezer Track. It's now the area behind the plaza at Harlem and Mineral Spring Roads. And I talked to you about that one before, known as Sulphur Springs, and then it became Mineral Springs. In 1860, the Lutherans built an orphanage, part of the Joint District 6 in the 1880 map, but later as number 8. It was the first school, small wooden building on Aurora Avenue, 3 windows on each side, and no basement. Grades 1 to 8 in a wilderness of fields and orchards. Only 3 roads in the area: Olean, Aurora, and Emporium. The enrollment was so big in 1890 They had a 2-story brick with basement across from the old building on Aurora. So the club room for the IOOF was what it was used for at my dissertation time, and now I think it's a mosque. Anybody live in the Winchester area? I think it's a mosque now, is it?
No, it's a different religion, but it's a small group meeting there.
Uh-huh.
It's not a mosque, no.
Enrollment gained again, and they wanted to rent St. William's Parochial School, but they had to have state approval, and no nuns in religious clothing could teach there. 1936, they became a common school district of Winchester. The Board of Education enlarged to 7 members, old families with German names like Bridenstine, Zwilling, Zimpfer, Munch, and Striegel. 1936, the district outgrew the school, and land bought was for a new building on Harlem Road. 1938-39, Winchester opened. Mr. Richard Ferrand was the building principal and the teacher of grade 8. In 1942, there was an addition to the building. Dark tan brick, still in use today, called for a high school to be added, but centralization changed that. So we're up to centralization, and I just have 1 card more. Centralization came in the 1970s. During the course of 100 years in West Seneca, there were 8 separate public school districts. They developed mostly from tiny, one-room structures to good, substantial educational buildings. They had rapid growth and rising costs and a question about the future for them. West Seneca was really these small hamlets with fierce loyalty to the schools near and dear to their hearts. On April 8, 1945, 1 representative from each of the districts, except 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, and 8, went to Albany. They returned with long-term study of centralization. Articles were published in papers, slingers were sent house to house, the advantages and the disadvantages were discussed at length. May 28, 1946, they centralized at the centralization meeting came at Ebenezer High School Auditorium and Gym. George Stoddard was the Commissioner of Education, and he decided it would be called the Central District of West Seneca and Orchard Park. 764 ayes and 522 noes. One of the largest central districts in New York State. June 5th, 1946, the first board meeting, Mr. Eleanor Rebman was elected chairman, and they needed a supervising principal, so they elected Mr. Goodritz. Then the new junior-senior high was built, and all 6 districts were to operate as before, including the 3 high schools, Ebenezer, Gardenville, and West Seneca Bellwood. Sites for the new building at Seneca and Main, 35 acres and 1 house, they had to pick a site. Center Road across from Lind had 58 acres, and Center Road east of Lind had 25 acres. They chose the Seneca and Main one. On October 11th, 1946, 1951 was noted to be the 2nd largest school district in New York State. Decided 1948 decided to hold the first graduation of West Seneca Central School District on June 25th at Kleinhand's Music Hall in Buffalo. Blue and gold were decided as the colors. The junior-senior prom that year was held at Winchester High School to keep it in the town. They didn't want it to go out of town. And that was the first prom I went to. And I went to one of the old German families with my date, Bridenstine. July 1951, Mr. Walter Campbell was appointed to assist Mr. Goodritz. 1953, it had 3,270 pupils and more expected. Expansion was moving and moving along. George Mueller was head of the expansion group, and he knew we needed junior highs and a new elementary. September 1955, Allendale opened. And guess who was the first principal? Mr. Butcher. Then Mr. Karl Heinz, and he was there until he died. And Walt Kissel filled in for September to January, and I came in January. And the enrollment by then was 5,037 students. 1961, District 5 came, 1963. They were totally included in our centralization And the population at centralization time was 6,815 students. When I left in 1980-somethings, because I actually retired in 1985, but I came back and took Mr. Camp's place at Winchester when he was out sick. Then I took, I can't remember, Miss Thomas's place at Potter Road when she transferred abruptly to Orchard Park. And so someplace in the 80s I retired, I don't know when. But I really felt that I learned a lot about the schools at that time, and I'm glad that I can tell you what little I know. Because they each, nobody kept records. And you heard Mr. Crawford, Dr. Crawford, say, they're not keeping records now either. And you really need to. What are our kids going to go back to? They need some foundation. They need to know where the school system started and how it developed and how it's going to keep on going. When I was there, we couldn't find enough buildings to put the kids in. Now you're closing them. Potter, which was a new building, closed. What's next? When I first met Mr. Crawford, he was principal at Northwood. Now he's our superintendent. For all the years I was there, except for the first one, Mr. Van Wagenen hired me, and he left right after that. Must be the reason. I was the first person from outside the district to be hired as an administrator. The rest all came from inside the district up to that point. And then I think Marilyn Toda was the next one. And then Ronnie Motes, because he had taught for me in Buffalo when I was a principal in Buffalo. And I told him there was an opening, and he applied, and he got the job. And then there was Mr. Green, and Mr. Green wasn't from outside, he was from inside the system. And I think who else?
Thank you so much, Dr. Allen. This is very nice.